Good evening. This is the first update from my new flat. It's not really my flat, it's subletting this place. It's very, very nice indeed. But this is very temporary. I'll be here until the beginning of December. It's now halfway through October. As a result of my being between flats, I've had other things to. The money thing hasn't been quite has become a slightly less pressing worry, I suppose. But I've actually, the CEX window shopping, or shopping, as the case may be, was as much a habit, really. So, it was a practical thing. It was going there, and so the thing that stopping me from buying games hasn't been so much not having the money to spend as not having the time to choose to do, not having the time to say, oh, let's wander over to CX, see what there is. Been very busy flat hunting. I've had various failures, various disappointments. This takes the pressure off, and with that, I had the peace of mind, the temporary freedom to, whatever I'm talking about. I went to see it, and it's not as if I haven't been doing that, but I went in and I thought, fuck it, I'm gonna get this thing. It is just the sort of thing that interests me. It's a Game Boy game. It is the Castlevania adventure. There's a "the" there. Not just Castlevania adventure, but the Castlevania adventure. Castlevania the adventure, maybe. This, I think I might have played this on an emulator, but I don't know much about it. I think it's a fairly ordinary, old school Castlevania style game, and it's just the sort of game that demonstrates what I find so kind of uniquely interesting about Game Boy games. The lack of mainstream titles on Game Boy. It wasn't Super Mario Bros. 4. It was Super Mario Land. Not Castlevania 5, but Castlevania the Adventure. I'm not sure how to say that name. I think you've got 3 different typefaces there. I wish this focused properly. Doesn't matter. Castlevania the Adventure. I think that's right. Because there's no, there isn't. I seem to remember on the ROM list on my Game Boy discography. Discography? Is that what you call it? Full Game Boy ROM list. Being Castlevania, the Adventure, but no way of telling from this. Yeah, there's something odd, and there's just usually something odd about Game Boy titles from known franchises, Ghosts and Goblins, Gremlin's Quest, is that what it's called? It seems to be it's a common thing of Game Boy titles, and it's not to say that these games are more ingenious or interesting, as games, but just that they exist is always kind of weird. They wouldn't have been made on any other console. They wouldn't have been made just for the next Nintendo home console. They're usually, well, they're often not better than the mainstream titles. Is that true? There's the danger that they won't be as good. I suppose that's maybe more true for ports and games that maybe do sort of posture as or pose as mainstream titles. I'm thinking of kind of notoriously bad Game Boy ports like Mortal Kombat, which I've not played, but kind of just heard about that from AVGN and that sort of thing. This perhaps is more likely to be good, and good in a way that sort of, in maybe a different way to the mainstream titles, because it, is, see what's happening to the light there, undersaturated, orange. Don't know if that's actually turning up on the recorded video. That's what I see though. It's kind of setting itself up as being slightly different. We shall see if that's the case. Now, I remember when I looked in CX, I didn't have a really good look at the condition of it before I asked at the counter to. It's like chewing gum or something. I'll clean that. Doesn't smell of anything, thank God. So I had a look at the condition when I got to the counter, and it was kind of funny because I kind of went to the woman at the desk was showing it to me on that plastic stand. It had the plastic sort of stand thing, and it had the game in front of it. I was like, can I just have a kind of a good look at its quality? And she was holding it and like rotating it. She was mainly showing me the pins. I was like, actually, the pins are surprisingly kind of silver looking. They're normally kind of goldy, or I don't know. Anyway, they look in good condition. But I was kind of more worried about the label, which is actually lovely, intact. I don't like discoloration of the plastic, which there's a small amount of. It's kind of only, I can't even really, it's like I can't look directly at it. I can't quite get it when I look at it, but when I sort of glance at it, there's shades of brown on it. I don't know how easy it is to see. The lighting in here is poor, but anyway, on the topic of kind of odd sequels and that kind of weird, the slightly distinctive sequel, or the thing that's distinctive about games from an established franchise having their appearance on the Game Boy, the kind of distinctive quality that the Game Boy games have, or at least the sort of slightly adventurous, or what could we do differently? I don't know, maybe that's just purely an appearance, but that's kind of more what I'm interested in than the games itself. That's what the appeal is. It's about oh, that's weird, I didn't know that game was on Game Boy, and it doesn't, and it looks different as a Game Boy game. It's got this weird name, it looks funny, and the game itself is kind of the box in a way. For me, the Game Boy games are the box, because you never really get the boxes with them. So that's always the way that, these days, and it's been true for a long time. I think, Game Boy games, their boxes pretty much got thrown out, I think, straight away. Whoop. Anyway, speaking of that, I saw, this kind of goes in the opposite direction. I was in Edinburgh looking at the CEX in Rose Street, which I had previously discounted as being a bit rubbish for retro games, but actually it's got a pretty good, well, I've been a couple times and it's had a pretty good selection of NES games compared to other CEXs. I mean, NES games are not terribly common. And it's funny that they're not common, but when they turn up, they're not always expensive. I don't know how to sort of analyse that in terms of, when you talk about common, I suppose I'm just talking about how often they come up for sale, but that's not the same as rarity. But then one must assume that if they're not rare, but they're not on sale in certain places very often, you have to assume there's just hordes of them sitting in people's collections somewhere, and no one wants them either. I don't know really how you analyse that stuff, but I don't see NES games for sale very often. But there was a bunch of them, and a bunch of kind of interesting ones at the CX in on Rose Street in Edinburgh. And among them was a game I didn't know existed. It was called Gargoyle's Quest 2. Gargoyle's Quest was kind of a sequel to Ghosts and Goblins, is that right? Which I think is different to Ghosts and Ghouls, or Ghouls and Goblins, or Goblins and Ghouls, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, something like that, on the Sega Mega Drive and the SNES. I think that's also kind of a parallel thing. It's a sequel to Ghosts and Goblins, whatever the fucking game it's called. Kind of a platform RPG-ish type thing for the Game Boy, which I covered in another video, talked about the bloody cartridge anyway. And it has a sequel on the NES, which is kind of odd. Because I became familiar with the Game Boy later, after the real era of the NES. That was always before my time. It seems like kind of a backward step, almost. It's hard to imagine that Gargoyle's Quest on the Game Boy came out before Gargoyle's Quest 2 on the NES. So that, I would have really liked to play that and to have that and to buy it, but because of my situation, I didn't really. I went there pretty much knowing I wasn't going to spend any money, just to window shop. I don't think I went terribly out of my way, just to sort of cover for my psychological profile there for a wee minute. But that really interests me, and I suppose that tells me and anyone else a little bit about my kind of reasons for collecting and stuff. It's don't know. It's just I suppose it's, unless I substantiate that interest, I suppose it comes down to a personal whim. What I choose to include in my collection, what I don't. Anyway, the last thing to flag up is that I don't know. I suppose supporting this notion that the NES is a strange console for a sequel to a Game Boy game to come out on. Supporting that is the idea I have in my head that the SNES must have been out before the Game Boy came out. I don't know that that's true, and actually when I think about it, I suspect that isn't true, because I also know that there was Tetris 2 on the NES, Then again, now I think about it, I think Tetris came out on the NES before the Game Boy, or did it? Because I always thought of Tetris as a flagship Game Boy game. Um, which isn't to say that it couldn't have been and also have been a port. You know, it's tied up in the stuff I'm rambling about is a lot of gaps in my knowledge and perhaps misinformation. But I don't know. Maybe the Game Boy was one of those things that just stuck around forever. I mean, I know that to an extent it did, um, because the arrival of the Game Boy Color was not really the arrival of a new console as such. It was a minority of games, really, that were Game Boy Color exclusives. Um, you don't really think of the Game Boy Color playing Game Boy games as being an example of backwards compatibility, you know. But the NES maybe also was a console that sort of stuck around, and maybe it's the case that Gargoyle's Quest 2 did come out at a time when the Super Nintendo was already released. But I don't know, I mean, that sort of thing was a little bit more common then. It wasn't so much the case that when a home console predecessor came out, the one before it pretty much died immediately. I think that was less true then. Now it seems as if, you know, as soon as the next such and such comes out, production and development just totally ceases on the thing before it. I remember when the DS came out, kind of tangentially, going off on a tangent, yeah, tangentially related point. I remember when the DS came out, it was talked about as a quote from where, I don't know, a third pillar, you know, that there would be the home console, N64, Wii, etc., the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and the DS, that there would be three concurrent streams of Nintendo consoles, two handhelds. That's how I remember it being talked about. It might have been NGC, which was the magazine I read at the time. Or, I mean, actually, now I think about it, I think I read Nintendo Official Magazine for a while as well. I think I read that after NGC, after I stopped reading NGC. And I think it was the last thing I read before stopping altogether. I read a couple of episodes of Edge, but I suppose it was a little bit adult for me. It talked a lot about the market and seemed to have this slightly cynical approach to talking about games and the kind of the handheld console war at the time, the DS and the PSP. So maybe it was in Nintendo Official Magazine, but it was. I read that somewhere. You know, these things can be wrong all the time, but it was certainly true that Game Boy Advance games kept coming out for a wee while after the DS was released, but that prophecy never really came true. In fact, you know, with the Switch being pretty much, I mean, I still don't have a Switch. I'd really like one, but don't have the money. With the Switch kind of being a fully home console, a fully, you know, home and fully handheld console, one could see the distinction between home console and handheld console disappear entirely. You can sort of see that trajectory when you look at the Game Boy, you know, the Game Boy and the GameCube or the N64 or whatever, you know, the Wii, the GameCube, you know, these, I don't know, like the Game Boy adapter, then the DS, and then the Wii U with its extra screen, and then the Switch where the extra screen is the controller and blah blah blah. I don't know. You can sort of see that happening. It does seem to have gone in that direction, but then I don't know. Who knows? I'll do.